in it. So for this, our last meeting, my presentation will be in two parts. One, the remainder of the discussion of the science of logic. That's going to be very brief. Inevitably, it's going to be unsatisfactory to dash through it anyway, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. I mostly want to focus on part two, which is a way of summarizing sort of the overall reading by looking at what I think are Hegel's most important philosophical contributions. And inevitably, that's also going to be very selective. But I want to talk about his account of how norms are related to actual attitudes. In largest terms, how he thinks we should understand ought in terms of is, or what's specified in deontic normative vocabulary in relation to what's specified in the alethic modal vocabulary of dispositions, laws, and facts. So both of these two can be thought of in terms of what Hegel makes of Kant's legacy. Each one of them develops one of Kant's big ideas. The science of logic is developing Kant's idea of the categories, of framework explicating concepts whose job is not to describe empirical goings on, but to make explicit features of the framework within which it's possible to describe and explain those goings on, which Kant thought of as knowable a priori, in the sense that in using any ground level concepts, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to deploy the categorical concepts. And the paradigm for Hegel, as for me, is logical concepts that are framework explicating in this sense. Anyway, that's the idea of Kant's that drives the science of logic as I understand it. In part two, the Kantian idea that I'll be developing as the axis around which, at any rate, my reading of Hegel revolves, is Kant's insight into the normative character of discursiveness, of intentionality in general. So I've put on the handout the ways in which I think Hegel moves beyond what he does in the Phenomenology in the science of logic, moving beyond the two-stage metacategorical structure of Verstand and Vernunft to a three-stage picture in which he rehearses, rationally reconstructs, recollects, an expressive progression from initially crude metacategorical structures that he groups together under the notion of Sein, of being, of immediacy, through a less crude structure of categories, shine, appearance, essence, distinguishing necessity and possibility as the context in which actuality is understood, and a final potentially adequate structure of metacategories, the Begriff, the concept. And within each of those, you find subcases that are themselves arranged in a progressive order from less expressively adequate to more. And in each case, the progression occurs as retrospectively, rationally reconstructed, that is, recollected, takes the form of unpacking what, from that retrospective recollective point of view, we can see as having been implicit in the earlier structures that's now made explicit. And here he emphasizes, and we'll see this when I come to look briefly at the closing paragraphs of the Science of Logic, he emphasizes to a greater extent than he does in the Phenomenology, the circular character of this procedure, because circular in the sense that the recollection insists that what it ends up with is just an explicit version of what shows up as having been all along implicit in the beginning point. So we see that the same content that shows up as having been implicit in the beginning has now been made explicit. That content takes two forms, an implicit form and an explicit form. That's a kind of expressive hylomorphism. This was always a feature of recollection as we saw it in the Phenomenology, but that circular character of each phase of this conceptual progression, as well as of the whole thing, that comes to take center stage in the Science of Logic. And before I look briefly at those, at a few actual passages, just so we can get some flavor of the sort of thing he's saying there, I wanted to mention briefly two reservations that I have about the move Hegel has made beyond the Phenomenology, two suggestions for critical emendation that I would offer, which I mentioned partly because they're responsible for my thinking that Hegel's best wisdom is better found in the Phenomenology than in the Science of Logic. This is the reason that my own engagement with him takes the form of a reading of the Phenomenology rather than the work that he himself took to best express his better wisdom. And the first is, as I mentioned at the end last time, his view that the constellation of meta-categories, meta-meta concepts, that he finally arrives at under the heading of the idea is fully and finally expressively adequate to understand the conceptual contents of categories and indeed of ground level determinate empirical and practical concepts. And I don't see any reason to believe that the process of developing and refining and making more expressively adequate categories and meta-categories has an endpoint any more than Hegel thinks the development of determinate empirical and practical concepts does. Now, I also think that that view that one can get finally fully adequate categorical conceptions and meta-categorical conceptions, it isn't that important to the Science of Logic. I think you can leave most of the structure there intact, even if you reject that systematic claim. But there's a second critical emendation that I would recommend that doesn't leave everything important intact to nearly the same extent. And that is to deny that the conceptual content of meta-concepts, including meta-categorical meta-meta concepts, the topic of the Science of Logic, to deny that that really is of a piece with the content of ground level concepts. The content of ground level concepts, he says, we can only understand in terms of the process of determining that content by engaging in the cycle of cognition and action, finding ourselves with incompatible commitments, the experience of cognitive error and practical failure, and answering the normative call to do something then to alter our conceptions, and recollectively to vindicate the alterations that we make by showing them to have been implicit all along. And what we see in the science of logic is his recollective reconstruction of the content of metacategorial concepts, and so of a set of categorical concepts in that recollective way that is shared with the development of ground level concepts, the way in which determining their content is mediating the immediate, giving the deliverances of sense conceptual shape. And the key point is of difference between these is that if we're working in the sort of semantic pragmatist methodological frame that Hegel adapts from Kant, that says we have to understand content in terms of the use of the content of concepts, in terms of the use of them. In the case of ground level concepts, the only concepts whose use there is to understand their content in terms of is their own use, the use of the whole constellation of ground level concepts that he sometimes talks about as the concept. But that's not true of meta concepts, whether categorical or metacategorical. Just because they are meta concepts expressed in a meta vocabulary, there's another vocabulary in terms of whose use we can understand their content, namely the use of the expressions for which they are meta-conceptual. They are a meta vocabulary. That gives us another pragmatist route to the content of the meta concepts. We can understand their content in terms of what they let us say about the use and content of the concepts for which they are providing us an expressively powerful meta vocabulary. We can go from the use of the base vocabulary to the content of the meta vocabulary. And there is no analog of that for the ground level concepts. So the functional pragmatic relation between use and content articulating norms is different in the case of categorical meta concepts than it is for ground level empirical concepts. And that's why I think we can jump to the end of the science of logic and say what the content of his metacategorially adequate categories is by looking at how they let us talk about the use of ground level concepts, rather than having to rehearse recollectively a course of development of them from less expressively adequate ones. So that's a sort of bottom-up way of understanding these meta concepts in terms of what they let us say about the use of the concepts for which they are meta concepts. What he's doing in the science of logic is a top-down account. We're going to understand the categorical concepts in terms of the development of the meta-categorial, meta-meta concepts that he rehearses in the science of logic. And only at the very end of the story, and in fact, something he doesn't even get to until we look at the philosophy of nature and the real philosophy, will we look at what having that adequate structure of metacategorial concepts, having a set of categorical concepts that exhibits that metacategorial structure, lets us say about the use of those ground level concepts. So he's talking about that, he's invoking that top-down level of explanation when he talks about the science of logic as pure thought thinking itself, or God's thoughts before the creation, because again, there's no particular set of ground level concepts that you need to have mastered in order to understand this top-down explanation. And in recommending a converse bottom-up strategy, which when I recommended that as a methodological strategy for reading the Phenomenology, I called the method of semantic descent. I'm actually endorsing a Kantian thesis. Kant's original insight, as I presented it, was that in addition to concepts whose expressive role it is to make explicit features of empirical goings on around us, there are concepts that have quite a different expressive role, a categorical expressive role, a framework explicating expressive role. And Kant made a sharp distinction between these two kinds of concepts. And the bottom-up order of explanation I'm recommending also does that. It says, by all means, understand the use of the ground level concepts in the categorical way that Hegel has given us, the historically biperspectival story about the process of determining their contents, but tell a different story about the content of those categorical concepts in terms of their expressive role in letting us talk about that process at the ground level. And in this way, my reading of Hegel, privileging the phenomenology over the science of logic, is a Kantian reading of Hegel. It's adapting what he would have seen as a retrograde, sort of conservative, zurück nach Kant reading, throwing away what he saw as massive conceptual progress in adopting this three-level top-down order of explanation. I mean, I should say, my reading of Kant is already pretty Hegelian. So to backslide in to this extent is not sort of taking everything back. And just before I pass on from that thought, this is different from the charge that I have some sympathy for and sensitivity to, that my reading of the phenomenology amounts to reconstructing Hegelian metacategories of Vernunft using only the resources of Kantian metacategories of Verstand. There's a sense in which that's a fair cop, and another way in which my reading of Hegel is recognizably a Kantian or neo-Kantian reading of him. But maybe with that background, we can look quickly at these last 7 paragraphs of the science of logic. I'm actually only going to look at, I think, the last 3 of them here. So they were on the handout last week and on the handout this week. And the thing to keep in mind is that he's thinking of these meta-categorical structures of the three gross kinds being essence and concept with their subkinds. He's thinking of all of them on the model of the determination of content of ground level concepts by recollective rationality. So if we look at the fourth of these last 7 paragraphs, he says it's in this manner that each step of the advance in the process of further determination, now we're talking about further determination of meta-categories, while getting further away from the indeterminate beginning, the originally maximally indeterminate being just the notion of immediacy of what is simply there, is also getting back nearer to it. And that therefore, what at first sight may appear to be different, the retrogressive grounding of the beginning and the progressive further determining of it coincide and are the same. The beginning is as such already something derived. Well, I claim we can understand that in terms of the historical process of determining the content of concepts. As I've described it, it has essentially a progressive perspective on it that is the determining in the sense of making the content be what it is, and an essentially retrospective, recollective perspective on it, which identifies the place we've gotten to with the place we started from, just that what was implicit there has now been unpacked and made explicit. That retrospective notion of determining is determining the content in the sense of finding it, where the progressive one is determining it in the sense of making it, sharpening it. And as we saw in the phenomenology, these are to coincide. So the genuine transit at the end of this passage, for the genuine transition from the universal to the particular and to the whole that is determined in and for itself, in which the whole, that first universal itself, according to its true determination, is again a moment, is alien to the above manner of division, and is alone the mediation of the science itself. Well, actually, that isn't, that really is not very clear, is it? All right, I'm just not going to talk about that passage, because the summing up of what he said at the beginning of that fourth paragraph is the first sentence of the fifth. By virtue of the nature of the method just indicated, the science exhibits itself as a circle, returning on itself, the end being wound back into the beginning, and the simple ground by the mediation. And this circle is moreover a circle of circles. That is, each of the sort of sub-moves in the logic itself has this circular explicative structure where the end and the beginning are identified. What I talked about as an expressive hylomorphism, one content that has an initially implicit form is given an explicit form. For each individual member, that is constellation of metaconcepts, as ensouled by the method, is reflected into itself. That reflection into itself is this circular process of explicating it, articulating it, so that in returning into the beginning, it is at the same time the beginning of a new member. When we get to the explicitation of where we began, that's the beginning of the next phase, where we'll unpack what's still implicit in that. links of this chain are the individual sciences. Here, Miller has helpfully added what he thinks Hegel is talking about, the three books of the encyclopedia, the logic, nature, and spirit. That's not at all what Hegel is talking about here. The links of this chain are the individual phases of the science of logic. He's not looking out to the encyclopedia. At least Miller has the good grace to put his interpolation, his unhelpful interpolation, into square brackets to indicate that it doesn't have anything to do with what's in the text. Each stage in the development of these metacategories has an antecedent and a successor, or expressed more accurate, has only the antecedent, the thing it made explicit, and indicates its successor in its conclusion. Well, because at the end of the next phase, we'll see that the successor was implicit already in the end of the earlier phase. So then these last two paragraphs are talking about what's distinctive about applying this method at the top level, at the metacategorial, meta conceptual level. The method is the pure Begriff that relates itself only to itself. Because it doesn't matter what ground level concepts we started from, or even what categorical concepts we started from. This method is going to unpack what was implicit in them, and by extracting that is going to take us inevitably to the next more expressively adequate stage structure of categories. It's the pure Begriff that relates itself only to itself. So it is simple self-relation being, the beginning. But now, at the end of the book, at the end of the process that is engaging in the science of logic, and now we have the achieved science of logic, the fully adequate set of metacategories, it is also fulfilled being, the notion that comprehends itself, because it comprehends all science, all the content of all concepts, including the metacategories that it has developed. In conclusion, there remains only this to be said about this idea, that in it first the science of logic has grasped its own Begriff. In the sphere of being, the beginning of its content, its Begriff appears as knowing in a subjective reflection external to that content, the stuff that's simply there and the knowing of it. But in the idea of absolute cognition, the notion has become the idea's own content. The idea is itself the pure Begriff, the concept that has itself for subject matter, and in running itself as subject matter through the totality of its determinations, develops itself into the whole of its reality, not reality tout court, that is, into the system of the science of logic, and concludes by apprehending this process of comprehending itself. Yeah, so in the final paragraph, the idea, which he's defined as the absolute unity of the concept and reality, that unity is what, in talking about the phenomenology, I talked about under the heading of conceptual realism, bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. The idea understands conceptual articulation as a unity that has these two aspects, subjective and objective. And if we abstract away the objective side, we get nature. That's what shows up in the first form of the idea, the last chapter of the doctrine of the concept, the third book of the science of logic, shows up as the idea of cognition. Nature is understood in terms of the process of determination of content. So the idea, positing itself as the absolute unity of the pure Begriff and its reality, and thus contracting itself into the immediacy of being, is the totality in this form, nature. But that determination hasn't issued from a process of becoming. It isn't yet recollected. The subjective notion in its totality becomes objectivity. The subjective end becomes life. He's talking about moving on to the second form of the idea of the good, looking at practical activity. The idea of cognition is the relation of this totality to the moment of independence of the objective pole. In cognition, the objective pole has authority over subjective processes, and that's the first sort of form of conceptual unity of the objective and the subjective that we get. The second one, the idea of the good, the practical idea rather than the cognitive idea, is the relation of this conceptually articulated unity of subjectivity and objectivity to the moment of dependence of the objective pole. The idea is in practical activity, my conceptions make themselves objective. My subjective conceptions impose themselves on reality. So the idea is the good is the relation of this unity to the dependence of the objective pole on the subjective pole, the authority of subjectivity over objectivity in intentional action. And the third perspective, the absolute idea, is the perspective of the science of logic. It's concerned only with the concept, the conceptual form that's common to the subjective and objective aspects. And the absolute idea is the deployment of meta-concepts that are adequate to comprehend the conceptual form, both of the subjective and the objective. So this is the Begriff that in its determination abides with itself. By reason of this freedom, the form of its determination is also utterly free. The externality of space and time existing absolutely on its own account without the moment of subjectivity. And then we bring in the subjective and penultimate sentence. But in this next resolve of the pure idea to determine itself as external idea, it thereby only posits for itself the mediation out of which the notion ascends as a free existence that has withdrawn itself from externality, that completes its self-realization in the science of spirit, and finds the supreme notion of itself in the science of logic as the self-comprehending pure notion. That is, he thinks he's shown us how by recollectively rehearsing an expressively progressive tradition of metacategorial concepts, we've gotten to a set that lets us understand that conceptual realism, the way in which both the subjective and the objective poles of the intentional nexus can be understood as conceptually articulated, and see those as two sides of one coin. The end is still the conceptual realism, but now comprehended through these meta-categorical development of categories adequate to understand it. Now, as I said last time, I can see why, after writing the Phenomenology, Hegel was fascinated with this idea of turning the crank another time, of coming down from the top in a way that owed nothing to the actual sequence of attitudes that anybody had adopted. Why he would be fascinated by this idea that it really was possible to rehearse the thoughts that God could have before the creation. But because of the two lines of critical complaint about the moves that he's making, I think it was based on a couple of mistakes, and that one can't actually bring off a project like this. And accordingly, that this isn't the most progressive direction, that the science of logic doesn't represent the most progressive direction to take the brilliant ideas of the phenomenology. And I haven't said nearly enough to justify that claim. I've really just waved my hands in the direction of how I see the science of logic as from Hegel's point of view, representing further progress from the phenomenology, but why I think I've at least gestured at reasons why I think we're better off staying where we are. So I should say a lot more I would have to say a lot more to be entitled to say any of the things I've said about the science of logic, but they're really not the topic of the course. I just didn't want to sort of leave the rest of Hegel ungestured at here. But what I want to do is sum up look back at the ground that we've covered in thinking about the phenomenology, and try and focus on what seems to me the most important idea that Hegel had, both the most brilliant philosophical move that he made and the one that matters most for our thinking today and represents his best credential to be taken seriously as a participant in our contemporary philosophical discussion, and not merely as one of the mighty dead who one might have an antiquarian interest in. And in the summing up that I'm beginning here at the end of the course, I'm struck that I'm going to be presenting things in the form of an alternate structure and expository strategy for the material of A Spirit of Trust. This discussion of the science of logic, as I mentioned last time, I had originally conceived A Spirit of Trust as ending with a chapter pointing in this direction. It was not to be. But the narrative path that I'm going to take through Hegel's thought in the Phenomenology here is one that I, for a long time, considered as a framing narrative for a spirit of trust. And in the end, though the way I'm going to talk about it shows up in the conclusion of that book, it isn't used to frame or orient the whole discussion. And here, the beginning of the story is Kant's discovery of discursive normativity, or his making explicit of that notion. I want to foreground this theme. Hegel's development of Kant's insight into the essentially normative character of discursive practice. So here's another road not taken. Jerry Schneewind offers, in his big book, a crucial survey of the antecedents in earlier modern philosophical thought of Kant's notion of autonomy, Kant's invention of autonomy. And in what, when we sort of went by it, I called the missing chapter, originally set to be chapter 9, in late drafts of A Spirit of Trust, which I didn't discuss in detail, but made available to you on the website. I retraced some of Schneewind's steps with the aim of displaying not how Kant developed this tradition in his notion of autonomy, but the different use that Hegel made of this same tradition of Aquinas, of Pufendorf and Crusius, of the British moralists, with the aim of displaying the rather different use that Hegel made of these traditions, the different lessons that he learned about normativity from them. And that chapter was nonetheless a sort of homage to Schneewind's efforts in understanding the intellectual antecedents of Kant's thought. But to my mind, Schneewind still misses an absolutely crucial feature of Kant's reconception of normativity, maybe the crucial feature of it. Because Schneewind still thinks with the tradition of Kant's reconception of normativity as exclusively a feature of his practical philosophy. What he misses in rehearsing what Kant took from the tradition, particularly of jurisprudential thought, but Enlightenment moral philosophy generally, that he inherited, is the way Kant broadened that topic substantially from the way it was conceived by his forebears. Because Kant saw the considerations that he assembled as addressing the normativity of discursiveness in general, not just on the side of practical agency, but also on the side of our understanding of theoretical cognition. And he took that lesson that concept use in general, discursive just means for Kant of or pertaining to concept use, he took that lesson about the normative nature of concept use of discursiveness generally to have actually been implicit in the Enlightenment tradition of early modern philosophy, even though it had not been brought out explicitly. He took it to be implicitly acknowledged by all his Enlightenment predecessors under the hazy but capacious heading of their thinking about the role of reason. Kant saw that the talk about the light of reason that imbued the early modern thought about cognitive activity as much as about practical activity, that the notion of the light of reason was always thought of as being normatively significant, as bearing on what one ought to think and how one ought to think, every bit as much as it did on how one ought to act or what one ought to do. But he also saw that his predecessors had not been clear about this normative significance of the notion of reason, about its origins or its nature or its operations. But his recollective rational reconstruction of his tradition sought to make explicit this implicit insight into the normative character of reason as such, which he saw as implicitly active in the tradition, even though it hadn't been thematized in particular on the side of cognition. So his key reconceptualization of the conceptual discursiveness in terms of concepts understood as rules for doing something, his explicit problematizing of the nature of the normative bindingness or validity, the Verbindlichkeit, the Gültigkeit of those rules, and his understanding of the genus of the two species into which he had synthesized the key meta-concepts of his empiricist and rationalist predecessors, unifying their confused talk about ideas under the genus of representation with these two species, intuition and concepts. That notion of representation that he understood itself in normative terms of the authority of representeds over the correctness of representings, the responsibility of representings to what they count as representing, all of those serve to articulate this new vision of discursiveness as fundamentally normative and the replacement of a problematic of understanding how mental stuff relates to physical stuff, with the problematic of understanding how rules relate to facts. Subsuming relations between mind and world and cognition no less than in intentional action, as depending on our understanding of the relation of ought to is, the oughts expressed in rules, in concepts, to what is, what in Hegel's terms becomes the relation to immediacy of conceptual mediation understood as normative. And I've suggested from the beginning that although I take this Kantian normative revolution to be wholly progressive, right from the beginning, it courted the danger of his principle orienting distinction between norms and facts turning into a corrosive dualism that would be a successor dualism to the mind-body Cartesian dualism. And here I'm thinking of a dualism as what a distinction becomes when it's drawn in such terms that the relation between the distinguished items becomes unintelligible. And Fred Beiser has argued with some force that 19th century neo-Kantian heirs to this conception, who were distinguished by their appreciation of Kant's normative turn, an insight that I think in many ways was lost for the first half of the 20th century, were ultimately unable to deal with this threat of the distinction between norms and facts turning into a dualism, and in Beiser's reading, succumbed to that danger. This is what he sees as the rock on which neo-Kantianism foundered. Anyway, that's the Kantian background against which Hegel makes what I see as his central philosophical contribution in the Phenomenology. And that's his naturalizing of normativity in a suitably broad and ultimately non-reductive sense of naturalizing. He criticizes the reductive naturalizing of normativity allegorically in his discussion of the Kammerdiener, the niederträchtig moral valet for whom no man is a hero, that is, norm responsive. And I take Hegel's principal philosophical contribution to be his strategy for naturalizing normativity in a non-reductive way, let's say in a suitably broad sense of naturalizing, along two dimensions, by making two moves, by bringing to bear two lines of thought that he ends up interweaving together and showing are complementary. That is, first, by socializing it, by understanding normative statuses as at base social statuses, understanding normative statuses, paradigmatically, the authority and responsibility that he discusses under the heading of independence and dependence, understanding normative statuses as synthesized by attitudes of reciprocal recognition, as the products of practical attitudes when those practical attitudes take the right social form. Social substance, the community, and essence, in the language that he's deploying in the preface, are both synthesized by mutual recognition. And second, by historicizing the relation between norms and facts, between normative statuses and normative attitudes, in his conception of the temporally biperspectival, retrospective, prospective process of determining conceptual content, whose key element is his brand new notion of recollective rationality, a new form of rationality that is more fundamental than theoretical or practical rationality. It's the ultimate semantogenic form of rationality, recollective rationality. And as you know, as I understand, the culmination of the book, the two notions of recognition and recollection come together into a moral vision of a new kind of self-conscious individual and their community that becomes possible when recognition takes the form of forgiving recollection. But I'm not going to talk about that outcome today. I want to talk about the way he construed normativity, say some more about the key ideas behind this socializing and historicizing of the notion of discursive normativity downstream from Kant. And close by saying something about how that achievement looks from the standpoint of one set of contemporary philosophical concerns, those raised by Wittgenstein and popularized by Kripke in the 1980s under the heading of the rule-following considerations. For it's here that I think we can see most clearly the relevance and significance of Hegel's contributions to the philosophical issues that I take to be still urgent current concerns. So that's my plan for the rest of this session, is first to remind you of the general outlines of the story I find Hegel telling about the nature of discursive norms and their relation to matters of fact, the relation of the norms that we specify in a deontic normative vocabulary of authority and responsibility, or entitlement and commitment on the one hand, and the matters of fact that we specify in an alethic modal vocabulary of what's actual, what's possible, of subjunctive dispositions and necessary laws. Those are the two sides that we saw already in a discussion of Hegel's introduction. His conceptual realism uses to understand the subjective and objective poles of the intentional nexus. So I first want to sketch the general outlines of Hegel's account of these, the way he deploys the distinctive concepts he uses to understand the relation between them in the social register and in the historical register, and then to say something about how Wittgenstein, as Kripke, has sensitized us to think of this line of thought, how that all looks from this point of view. So first, about the social dimension of normative attitudes and normative statuses. In Hegel's terms, the problematic that he inherited from Kant becomes how to understand the bindingness of norms, indeed, the rational bindingness of norms, because these are discursive norms. They're the norms that articulate what's a reason for what. They're rational in the sense of being the very structure of reasons, not in answering to some antecedent standard of rationality, but in being what articulates rationality itself. How to understand the bindingness of these reason constituting norms. Once we understand them to be socially instituted by the attitudes that practitioners actually adopt. That wasn't Kant's problem because he didn't have the second half of that. He wasn't understanding the norms as socially instituted. But Hegel's going to understand them as socially instituted by recognitive attitudes that practitioners actually adopt. And it's those attitudes, taking something to be correct or incorrect, attributing a responsibility or some authority, or committing oneself, exercising one's authority to make oneself responsible. Those normative attitudes are what are in the causal order. We can have normative attitudes elicited from us by the environment when we respond to the way the world looks by undertaking a perceptual commitment, making a perceptual judgment. And it's those normative attitudes that can be efficacious. I commit myself to turning on the light, and that causes the switch to be flipped. Those normative attitudes are in the causal order. How are we to understand genuinely binding norms as instituted by that sort of attitude? I say that the attitudes that practitioners actually adopt, here it doesn't matter if you throw in dispositions. The dispositions are also specified in alethic modal terms of subjunctive robustness. And the issue is how to get from what we can specify in those kinds of terms to being able to underwrite the applicability of deontic normative notions of authority and responsibility, Hegel's independence and dependence when we're talking on the side of subjects, which are the two sides of bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. And in the terms I've recommended and employed in setting out Hegel's project, this is the question of how to understand the status dependence of normative attitudes in light of an appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. And again, the status dependence of normative attitudes was the constitutive insight of traditional forms of life. The appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses is the constitutive principle of modern forms of life, and thereon hangs a tale for Hegel. But I'm also not going to talk about that aspect of his thought at this point. Just remember that when I talk about statuses being dependent on attitudes and attitudes being dependent on statuses, dependence is a normative notion for Hegel. That's talking about the authority of norms, normative statuses, over normative attitudes, the responsibility of normative statuses to normative attitudes which institute them. For both of these, we want to keep track of what relations we specify in deontic normative vocabulary and what we specify in alethic modal vocabulary, because it's the relation between what we can say in those two kinds of vocabulary that's ultimately at issue. So I understand Hegel's talk, his idea about the social character of normativity, as taking off from the Enlightenment thought that it makes no sense to talk about deontic normative statuses of responsibility and authority, except in a context that includes attitudes of holding somebody responsible or attributing authority to them or acknowledging their authority. That apart from our adopting those attitudes of attributing responsibility and authority or claiming it for ourselves, talk of having authority or being responsible doesn't make any sense. That really was a distinctively modern insight. Its purest form is found in social contract theories of political obligation that seek to derive the status of the authority of the state or the sovereign, the subject's responsibility to a political sovereign from attitudes of promising, contracting, entering into an agreement, even if it's only an agreement they would enter into if they had any sense. And it's a step beyond that thought of the bare thought of that attitude dependence of normative statuses to think of normative statuses as instituted by normative attitudes, as authoritative over them. But Hegel's basic idea on the social side is that if we think about that basic Kantian normative status of committing yourself, undertaking a responsibility, Hegel has the idea that one's own attitude of taking responsibility, of committing oneself, is successful in making one responsible. That is, in instituting an actual normative status of responsibility, just in case others concur. That is, in case others accept your attitude and hold you responsible. That is, in case they adopt complementary attitudes of taking you to be responsible. So, my attitude of acknowledging a responsibility, myself, committing myself, is successful in instituting a genuine normative status only if it's socially complemented by others actually holding me responsible, taking me to be committed. Now, if you have a view like that, that sees normative statuses as instituted by complementary normative attitudes, the first question is, well, whose attitudes matter to whether I'm genuinely committed or responsible or indeed have some authority? And one popular answer, already antedating Hegel, was to invoke a pre-established community and say, well, it's the other people who are in your community. They have to do this. And this notion was popular in responses to Kripke's Wittgenstein. Crispin Wright is maybe the most prominent proponent of a view like that. But there's a cost to a view like that. The notion of community is itself a normative notion if it's going to be used in this way. And Hegel, at any rate, goes a different way. He adopts what in making it explicit, I called an I-thou model of sociality rather than an I-we model. That is, sociality has to do with the distinction of social perspective between undertaking a responsibility oneself and attributing it to somebody else, rather than the distinction between my attitude and our attitudes. His idea is that those whose attitudes of recognizing one as responsible are constitutive of one actually being responsible are those one has granted that authority to by one's own recognitive attitudes. Their attitudes are constitutive of my statuses if they suitably complement my petition for their recognition, my petition for them to hold me responsible. If that's recognized, if they actually adopt those statuses, but who? The ones I've actually adopted an attitude of recognition to, the ones I've authorized to hold me responsible, the ones in whom I have invested the authority constitutively to recognize me as responsible, to hold me responsible. A kind of example of this that Hegel doesn't use as an example in particular is various important ceremonies. When I married my wife Barbara, very close to 50 years ago now, I stood up in front of people we had invited there to hear me and her commit ourselves to going through life together, authorizing them to hold us responsible for the undertaking we were publicly making at that time. And Hegel says that's how a real commitment gets made, how a normative status gets instituted, is when those you have authorized to hold you responsible and a petition for recognition of your undertaking of a commitment actually do hold you to that commitment, do take you to be responsible. That's what it is really to be committed or responsible. And similarly for authority. And the result is his notion of reciprocal recognition, gegenseitig Anerkennung. A genuine normative status is instituted by one's own attitudes when one is recognized as having that status by those one actually recognizes and has thereby authorized to hold one responsible to attribute that status or to withhold that attribution. But when one's own actual attitudes, both in committing oneself and in recognizing others, mesh suitably with their actual attitudes, so that there is mutual recognition, then genuine normative statuses are instituted. And this, I think, is a radical and brilliant metaphysics of normativity, a way of forging a link between the adoption of practical attitudes, what can be caused and be causally efficacious in turn, on the one hand, and normative statuses of authority and responsibility, which can only be causally efficacious when mediated by those attitudes. The idea of genuine normative statuses as instituted by one's own attitudes, just when one is recognized as having that status by those one recognizes, is a template for an account of how we can collectively lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps and institute genuine normative statuses by our attitudes. And I think it's a brilliant idea. It has a theoretical structure that one can work with, by contrast to Wittgenstein's vague talk about norms being features of social practices, or, as he says, customs, uses, and institutions. So I want to say something about how this thought can be exploited to address the skeptical worries that, though he was not himself in the end skeptical in this way, Wittgenstein nonetheless calls to our attention as stemming from bad ways of thinking about these norms implicit in social practices. Okay, now's a good time for us to take a break. When we come back, I'll talk about the historical dimension and then about the Kripkenstein issues. I have 12 minutes of the hour. Why don't we come back at the hour? Okay. So the first piece of Hegel's response to the challenge to say how, once we've taken on board the idea that normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes, that strong form of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, how can we understand the status dependence of normative attitudes, the genuine bindingness of norms on our attitudes? The first piece of his response is his idea of the essentially social character of norms as worked out in the conception of norms as instituted by reciprocal recognition, by practical recognitive attitudes when they have the right reciprocal social structure. But he combines that with a second idea, the idea that conceptual norms are essentially historical in nature. And here, the basic underlying idea is also simple as the motivating thought behind the sociality was. We can reconcile the idea that normative statuses exercise authority over normative attitudes by providing standards for their assessment as correct, with the idea that those statuses are instituted by normative attitudes, if we take seriously the idea that communities, social substance synthesized by reciprocal recognition for Hegel, are temporally extended. Because then we can understand norms instituted by past attitudes of practitioners as binding or governing on the attitudes of present practitioners. Means, all right, well, the institution happened by past attitudes, but we're now bound by those norms that got instituted. This is another way you might get around Wittgenstein's worry about the intelligibility of the transcendence of attitudes by norms that he puts by saying, if whatever seems to me right is right, if all there is to the norm is my attitude, then there can be no question of right or wrong. Somehow we have to get norms as able to bind, normatively bind attitudes. They have to go beyond it. And one way to do that is to go diachronic and look at the binding of later attitudes by norms instituted by earlier attitudes. This is compatible with saying that we institute the norms that we are bound by. That's what's required by the idea of autonomy as being bound by laws one has laid down for oneself that Kant took over from Rousseau. Remember, I expressed my admiration for this conceptual move where Rousseau famously defined freedom as obedience to a law one has laid down for oneself. And it's because of that that Kant had as the only decoration in his writing room, a portrait of Rousseau. But Kant turned that thought, that definition of freedom, into a criterion of demarcation of genuinely normative bindingness. That was his autonomy notion, that you're genuinely normatively bound only by laws you've bound yourself by. You're genuinely committed only to commitments you acknowledge. Well, that thought in social form, we institute the norms we are bound by, that still would hold. If we say norms are the mediating mechanisms by which the attitudes of past practitioners bind the attitudes of present practitioners, where the bindingness is understood as a matter of providing standards for the assessment of the correctness of the later attitudes according to those norms. I can't resist mentioning in passing this idea that genuinely authoritative norms, normatively binding, genuinely normatively binding norms have to be self-imposed. The ones we bind ourselves by is the lesson one would learn if one looked at the history of the extension of the voting franchise. Originally, only paterfamilias, heads of families, could vote, then only people who owned real property, only male heads of household, and so on and so on. If one sees the norm that's implicit in that expressive development as the norm that everyone who's bound by a law should have a say in determining what the law is, an ideal that we're not yet close to satisfying, That would be the Kantian picture. And one can still have a version of that on this historical picture. I mean, the insight that one way to get a norm that transcends our attitudes right now is to see the norm as instituted by past attitudes. A very flat-footed version of that idea would understand the division between the actual activity that institutes norms and the activity that applies or is subject to assessment according to them, in that sense is bound by them, as distinct and sequential. You say, oh yes, the legislator, Solon, lays down the laws, and then subsequent generations are bound by them. Or in a case that's more general and more immediately applicable to the case at hand, namely to discursive norms in general, but an instance still of this flat-footed way of thinking about the historical character of the relation between norms and normative attitudes, is Carnap's way. He says, look, first, he says, pick a language, fix the meanings of your terms. That institutes the norms, the conceptual norms. And then in a second phase, you apply those concepts to characterize what's actual and possible and necessary, formulating a theory, forming your beliefs by applying those concepts according to the standards that you laid down when you settled the language and fixed your meanings. But in that Carnap case, and sort of what I'm thinking of when I say that's a flat-footed way of developing this insight, Quine rightly objects to Carnap that picture at most applies to the cases that inspired it, artificial languages, paradigmatically logistical calculi, whose meanings are stipulated in a more expressively powerful meta-language. But if we're talking about natural language, all there is to settle the use, to settle the meanings of the terms is the use we make of them. That is, the applications we make of them. There isn't one phase in which we do something that settles the meanings, and then a second phase in which, having settled those meanings, we now go about applying them according to the norms we instituted. All we do is make claims and justify and contest them. That's the use of the language, and that has to be intelligible in the end as both instituting the meanings and being governed by them. And the question of how we can understand it as doing both of those, that's the problematic. And Hegel has a Quine-like rather than a Carnap-like picture of the way in which the distinction of temporal perspective between past and present can be used to articulate the relation between normative statuses and normative attitudes. He sees the process of instituting norms by attitudes that we actually adopt, and the process of applying those norms to assess the correctness of the attitudes we actually adopt as two sides of one coin, or more properly, two aspects of or perspectives on one process. At every point in an extended process, a temporally extended practice, both things are going on. Further determination of the content of the norm, corresponding to the institution of the norm, and acknowledgement of the authority of the norm as inherited, corresponding to applications of the norm that are acknowledged to be subject to normative assessment as correct or incorrect, according to the norms that have been instituted by prior uses. So instead of having just two phases, one of institution and one of application and assessment, institution of norms, and then by attitudes, and then a second one of application and assessment of the correctness of applications according to the norms settled in the first phase, we say these are two perspectives that apply to every bit of the use of the vocabulary. And this is where I found it enlightening and helpful to invoke the jurisprudential model of judges working at common or case law, as opposed to statute law. Every decision they make, which is the official attitudes that they're adopting, should be understood both as applying previously settled law, norms that bind it in the sense of providing standards for assessment of the correctness of the decision, given the law that was being applied, and also as instituting the law that will be inherited by their successors, further determining that content. Common and case law are properly understood as judge-made law. But it's also true that judges are properly understood as bound, indeed rationally bound, by the norms instituted by the precedents that they inherit. Now, in using this as a model, there's a danger of explaining the obscure by the more obscure. It's not as though philosophers of law are unanimous in their understanding of what's going on in these jurisprudential cases. And sometimes wearing a slightly different hat, I try and bring Hegel's account of this process to bear in helping them find vocabulary to talk about what's going on there. But regarded prospectively, in making a decision, the judge is making the law, instituting the norm, exercising authority over it. There isn't anything except that the decisions of judges to common law or case law. But regarded retrospectively, they're bound by the law. They're bound to apply the norm, to acknowledge their responsibility of their attitude, of their decision to the norm that they inherit. And that responsibility is administered on behalf of the norm they inherit by the later judges who will assess the correctness of the current judge's decision based on the extent to which it is appropriately acknowledging its responsibility to, is appropriately responsive to the norm that was instituted. Now, without appealing to that particular jurisprudential model, which it's in Anglo-American law, good and sufficient reason, but without appealing to that particular model, Hegel understood this historical structure of authority and responsibility that relates past, present, and future judges. He saw how that could make sense, both of the attitude dependence of normative statuses and the status dependence of normative attitudes. And he saw that at its heart is a hitherto unrecognized kind of rationality, recollective rationality. And this is the sort of rationality exercised by the judge in justifying her decision, in giving a rationale for her decision, by retrospectively, rationally reconstructing the tradition that she inherits, extracting from it a trajectory of expressively progressive precedents, each of which earlier actual decisions, according to her recollective rational reconstruction, made visible, made explicit another aspect, a further aspect that then showed up as having been implicit in the prior tradition all along. That kind of recollective rational reconstruction is a kind of doing, a kind of making that essentially has the form of a finding. It says, look, what I'm doing here is just making explicit what was implicit in the prior tradition. This is expressive rationality. And this was the fundamental kind of rationality for Hegel. It's the form, this recollective form is the form of reason's march through history in that phrase of his. Most fundamentally, it's the kind of rationality he's invoking when he says, on he who looks rationally on the world looks rationally back. Looking on the world rationally is doing this recollective reconstruction, a finding of an expressively progressive trajectory through the actual applications of the concept. And the world looking rationally back is you're finding an implicit norm, which is, according to your recollection, according to your recollective narrative, vindicating the decision, the attitude you're adopting, the decision you're making, was implicit all along and is the appropriate normative standard for assessing the correctness of all of the prior decisions, including one's own. So it's a hard job doing that. That's the making. But it's essential that it says it's finding something. And yet, giving that sort of vindication, justification of what one does, saying, look, I'm just being responsible to the norm I inherited, that's what puts, little by little, new content into the concept, draws boundaries that were left open by the previous decisions. This is the process of rationally turning a past, a sequence of actual events, actual causally efficacious attitudes, into a history, giving it the distinctive structure of authority and responsibility that are characteristic of a tradition, a norm instituting tradition, by discerning in the past actual attitudes a trajectory that's expressively progressive. And this is the way we're to see applying norms, which expresses the status dependence of normative attitudes and the institution of norms by attitudes, that attitude dependence of normative statuses, as two sides of one coin, or we can say now more perspicuously and specifically, two temporal perspectives on one process. Looking forward, it's a process of making the norm more determinate, determining its content in that sense. Looked at retrospectively, it's a matter of determining the content in the sense of finding out what the content was all along, according to that recollective story. Of course, the very next recollection is going to find a somewhat different norm than the earlier one did. The norms that emerge from one episode of recollection will turn out, when properly applied according to their own lights, to lead to incompatible commitments by one's own lights, which will show that you didn't get things quite right. That's the prospective experience of error and failure. Anyway, that's the historical dimension of Hegel's account of normativity, of his social and historical metaphysics of normativity. And he finds that a distinctive structure of authority and responsibility relating, in my model, the past judges, the present judge, and the future judges who will assess how good a job the present judge did according to their recollection, recollective uncovering of the norm that was implicit. He sees in that an instance of reciprocal recognition. It's just diachronic rather than synchronic, but every judge only has the authority she's recognized as having. Every judge recognizes the authority of other judges, but it's essentially a temporally extended community that is the recognitive community. Now, what I want to do is establish connections between Hegel's answer, that account, and the question that Kripke's Wittgenstein asks in somewhat different vocabulary. The skeptical arguments about semantic norms that Kripke attributes to Wittgenstein are expressions of alienation in Hegel's sense, in that they essentially consist, Kripke's Wittgenstein's arguments essentially consist in the confrontation of the status dependence of normative attitudes with the attitude dependence of normative statuses, and draw the conclusion that if all there is to institute norms, normative statuses, is actual attitudes, then the notion that genuine norms have been instituted, which are intelligible as binding our attitudes, sorting them into correct, serving as standards for assessing them as correct or incorrect, becomes unintelligible. Kripke's Wittgenstein is arguing that insofar as we understand norms as instituted by our use, norms governing the use of our expressions as instituted by our actual use of the expressions, the attitudes we actually adopt, that normativity becomes unintelligible. And my claim is that in the Phenomenology in 1806, Hegel had a well-worked out, elaborate, systematic response to that skepticism. And I sometimes like to speculate about how different the history of philosophy would have looked if people had been able to read the book that way back then. And I was tempted, I said a few minutes ago, to use this confrontation, the Kripke's Wittgenstein question and Hegel's elaborate and developed answer to it as the framing narrative for a book about the phenomenology. And as it is, I thought, well, there's too much else going on. It went a different way, though this note gets hit in the conclusion. But let me remind you about the Kripke's argumentation. Parenthetically, let me say that his book on Wittgenstein on rules in private language is an only very lightly rewritten version of Kripke's undergraduate honors thesis at Harvard. He wrote it when he was 20 years old. Only the footnotes in the first edition are different from the honors thesis that that he wrote as an undergraduate. Only one of many reasons it was intimidating to be one of Kripke's graduate students. So Kripke begins with what's in fact a Kantian insight. Applying a concept has normative consequences. In his example, meaning plus by the plus sign includes undertaking commitments as to how it would be correct to apply the expression in cases that go beyond actual ones that I've made, that go beyond my actual attitudes. In the language I've been using to articulate Hegel's views, adopting a determinately contentful attitude, acquiring a belief or forming an intention, is undertaking, or as it may be, attributing a normative status. The commitment undertaken, the status acquired by using the expression is significant for assessments of the correctness of future applications. So, if I speculate that the coin is copper, I've committed myself to its melting at 1,084 degrees centigrade, sort of whether I know that or not. That's part of what it means for something to be copper. The commitment I've undertaken by calling it copper is significant for the assessment of correctness of applications. It's a commitment or a responsibility one undertakes. And so having such a status is subjecting yourself to a norm. It's binding yourself by, in Kant's term, a rule that is curled up in the concept of copper, binding yourself in the sense of making yourself liable to normative assessment as to the correctness of one's application according to the standard set by that norm. So one's attitudes become subject to it. And the content determines what norm one's making oneself liable to. This is the way Kripke talks about this, what I've been calling the status dependence of normative attitudes. As normative attitudes, they have virtual objects. I'm committing myself to the coin being copper and binding myself by the copper norm. And so Kripke's Wittgenstein can argue that the determinate contentfulness of my normative attitudes, my believing or intending something, is intelligible only insofar as it's understood as being responsible to the norms. That is, insofar as some norms are authoritative with respect to assessments of correctness. So that's the first step. Already, though Kripke doesn't know that, and there's no evidence that Wittgenstein thought of this as a Kantian point, it's a Kantian point. The second step in setting up the skeptical argument directed against the criterion of adequacy of making sense of the status dependence of normative attitudes is to appeal precisely to the attitude dependence of normative statuses. We can ask, what's the source of the norms that set standards for assessments of the correctness of the attitudes that are applications of concepts such as plus or copper? And Kripke's Wittgenstein's second claim is that only the use of the expressions can do that. All there is to settle these norms is the way we have used the concept copper and the concept plus. That's a matter of the attitudes that have actually been adopted, or if you like, the dispositions that we have actually to apply the concept. Nothing turns on that. The way Kripke puts the question, what fact is it about the use of the expression plus or the word copper, in virtue of which it means plus and copper? The challenge becomes understanding how the adoption of a set of prior attitudes that are applications of the concept in some circumstances and withholding of applications of it in others, or dispositions to do that. How can they determine a norm that governs possible future applications to different cases in the sense of determining a standard for normatively assessing whether going on that way to apply it or not apply it in the new future cases would be correct or incorrect? Now, I hope it's apparent that this is the same question that jurisprudential theorists have to have about the institution of determinately contentful legal norms by the decisions of prior judges. So, first step is an acknowledgement of the status dependence of normative attitudes. Second is an insistence on the attitude dependence of normative statuses, indeed, that they're instituted by our attitudes. And the third move is then the claim that there's no way to explain how any course of past actual applications of a concept could determine normative standards for assessing the correctness of novel possible future uses. How is the passage from an is to an ought possible here? It is applied in this case, or was applied in this case, and not in this other. How is that supposed to settle how we ought to apply it in the future? Well, Hegel has a detailed account of how oughts precipitate out of actual attitudes. That's what his social historical metaphysics of normativity is supposed to do. But Kripke-Wittgenstein asks, what gives those past applications binding normative force over future ones? What establishes a determinately contentful standard for assessment of correctness of the use? And it's in aid of that that you point out that it's possible to rationalize essentially any way of going on by gerrymandering some regularity that was exhibited by the past applications and would count your current application in. What's needed is some way to privilege one or at least some of those ways of going on as the ones we were implicitly committing ourselves to by making the practical judgments that we did in the past. So the conclusion Kripke-Wittgenstein comes to is that if we accept that all there is to institute a conceptual norm is prior uses of the concept, actual attitudes, then it's at least hard to see how such uses can institute a norm that's sufficiently determinate to serve as a standard of correctness for an indefinite number of further possible uses. That is, accepting the attitude dependence of normative statuses seems to rule out the authority of those attitude instituted norms over further attitudes. It seems to rule out the status dependence of normative attitudes. That's exactly what Hegel diagnosed as alienation, the worm in the shiny apple of modernity, the threat that came with the insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses. Now, I think that as I've just characterized the argument. Kripke's right to find this argument in Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is the one in our own time, or near enough, middle of the 20th century, who came independently, as far as can be told, on an appreciation of the essentially normative character of intentional states. He understands being in an intentional state, paradigmatically a belief or an intention, the sort of cognitive and practical side, as involving a kind of normative status, as committing oneself to how things are or how they are to be, making oneself liable to normative assessments as to the correctness of one's belief or the success of one's intention, depending upon whether things are as one committed oneself to them being or to them being. And Wittgenstein, I think, is interested in the kind of puzzlement that we might have about that normative significance. In section 70 of the Investigations, he says, someone says to me, show the children a game. I teach them gambling with dice. And the other says, well, I didn't mean that kind of game. And he says, must the exclusion of the game with dice have come to his mind when he gave me that order? And that's the end of the quote. But Wittgenstein clearly thinks that it was correct to say, I didn't mean that kind of game. And it doesn't depend on the person who made the request, show the children a game, having explicitly thought about that. But then where did that norm come from? What is it that determined that that was not an appropriate way to respond to the request, that didn't fulfill the request? And this is a puzzlement of a piece with the sort that Wittgenstein means to evoke in us when he asks, what is there more to the signpost in virtue of which it's correct to follow it one way and not the other? What is there more to it beyond just the piece of wood that's there, in virtue of which it has this normative significance, that there's a difference between following it correctly and incorrectly? And I think the way the issue comes up for Wittgenstein is that he appreciates the contingency of our conceptual norms, the way in which they're dependent on features of our embodiment or our social practices, or just the actual course of development of the application of that concept in connection with others, that could have gone otherwise. And if they had been otherwise or gone otherwise, we would mean something different. And he thinks that we have a picture of what meanings must be, of what these conceptual norms must be, that makes it puzzling to us that when we've seen this contingency of them, the idea that there are genuine norms that are binding on us, even though this is not one of Wittgenstein's words, rationally binding on us, because these conceptual norms are what determine, or at least articulate, what's a reason for what. He thinks that undercuts the intelligibility for us of the norm being there, the norm that is constitutive of, at least partly constitutive of, the meaning. Now, Wittgenstein's ultimate point, I take it, was to disabuse us of the features of our understanding of discursive normativity that caused that puzzlement. And he thought that he could diagnose an error behind this puzzlement and disabuse us of these inherited ways of thinking, thinking of meanings as something like what Quine meant by talking about the myth of the museum, the meanings as crystals stored up somewhere in our minds. He thought he could do that without giving us an alternative model, by telling his toy stories about practices where we can see there isn't anything mysterious about them. Well isn't talking like that in these various ways. Hegel thinks we need an alternative story, and he provides one. One other perspective on this issue that I want to bring into play, remind you of, rehearse a little bit, is the problem of genealogy. Genealogy undercuts the legitimacy of some practices. Our sense that a belief or a set of beliefs is rationally justified by giving a Kammerdiner's genealogical story about it. That is, by showing us how, if certain contingent facts had been different, our belief would have been different. That is, showing true counterfactuals, or anyway, subjunctively robust conditionals, that if fact X had been different, your belief B would have been different. Where fact X does not in any way supply a reason for believing B or not believing B. It's rationally and evidentially independent. These are counterfactuals that codify the dependence of an actual attitude of believing, acknowledging or undertaking a doxastic commitment, on the occurrence of events that don't provide reasons or evidence justifying the content that's believed. So that don't stand in a normative justifying relation to the content believed, but which the genealogist can convincingly argue are causally explicative, causally explain the actual attitude of believing. So the great unmaskers of the late 19th and early 20th century, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, all told stories of this shape. If one's approval of treating labor as a commodity is due to one's bourgeois upbringing, if one's Christian humility is the result of ressentiment, if one's authoritarianism should be understood as stemming from unresolved conflicts left over from the family romance, then the justifiability and normative force of those commitments is challenged. Because being raised in bourgeois circumstances isn't evidence of the justice of labor markets. Being driven by ressentiment doesn't provide reasons for esteeming humility, and Oedipal rivalry with one's father doesn't justify adopting authoritarian attitudes. Genealogies point to causes of actual attitudes that are contingent relative to the norms articulating the contents of concepts. And I think Wittgenstein thought in this area, his thought begins with appreciation of the contingencies that make these genealogical stories possible. We inherit are ways of using expressions that both are essential to their meaning, what they do, and show on their surface the contingencies of the processes that led to these words having this meaning. We're just thrown into a situation like that. It's a kind of semantic Geworfenheit, to use a Heideggerian metaphor. And I think Hegel thinks that that sense of semantic Geworfenheit, that genealogical explanations of our attitudes, ones that owe nothing to the efficacy of the norms that articulate the contents of them, threatens our sense that we genuinely are bound by those norms. That sense of having the bindingness of the norms that make you the discursive creature you are threatened, that's alienation in Hegel's sense. And Wittgenstein, I think, thinks that any account of discursive normativity that treats the fact of our semantic Geworfenheit and the possibility of genealogies as undercutting the legitimacy of the norms. This is what, in the jurisprudential context, is the fact that one can explain a decision by invoking what the judge had for breakfast in their slogan. Any account that treats the genealogical explicability or semantic Geworfenheit as undercutting the legitimacy of those norms, that is, any alienating account in Hegel's terms, should be rejected. It's incorporating an evidently mistaken metaphysics of normativity. And Wittgenstein thinks we can just push that aside without putting in its place any substantive alternative account. Just don't worry about semantic normativity. Just describe these facts about it. That, to continue the Heideggerian metaphor, is Gelassenheit, is what he's suggesting. Just let it all be. Don't try and give a theoretical account of how oughts can precipitate from the ises that are descriptions of the actual attitudes people have adopted. That Gelassenheit is his theoretical quietism. And in contrast, Hegel offers a detailed, systematic account of the process by which and in which actual and so contingent attitudes of applying concepts both institute norms that govern such applications and acknowledge the authority of such norms. That's what he builds out of his social and historical approaches to normativity. Now, I think we don't have a consensus response to the concerns that Wittgenstein raised and Kripke drew attention to. I think we don't have a generally agreed upon account of the relation of conceptual normativity to genealogical debunking mystifications of it. Maybe Hegel's isn't, in the end, the story that we want to tell. But I think it's something like the best story there is, the best story I know about the relation between oughts and ises, between norms and normative attitudes. And it seems to me that it deserves a place in the contemporary philosophical discussion about discursive normativity, the institution and application of conceptual norms, the relation between facts about the use of linguistic expressions in pragmatics and the norms that articulate the contents that those concepts have in the semantics. It is, in any case, Hegel's story about the relation between what's expressed in deontic normative metavocabularies, the kind we use to articulate the activities of knowing and acting subjects, on the one hand, and what's expressed by the elethic modal vocabulary that we use to describe the facts about propertied objects standing in lawful relations on the objective side of the intentional nexus. This double-barreled social and historical account of the relation between what's expressed in normative vocabulary and what's expressed in the kind of matter-of-factual vocabulary that includes actualities, possibilities, and necessities is what I denominate the conceptual idealism that is his ultimate explanation of the conceptual realism with which he begins. The idea that the fact that things are thus and so has conceptual content articulated in terms of material incompatibilities, describable in elethic modal terms of what's possible and impossible, whereas our thought can have the very same, that things are thus and so, can have the very same conceptual content, but articulated in deontic normative terms of what commitments are incompatible with each other or necessitate one another. So I see him as telling a story that starts with that conceptual realism and ends with the sophisticated account of the relation between the use of these different kinds of metavocabulary, the deontic and the elethic vocabularies. So that's what I would like people to take away from a reading of the Phenomenology, and what my book is meant to be a mediating instrument for sort of extracting such lessons from the book. And as you will see, as I've been trying to articulate, I don't see the study of Hegel's thought on these matters as being of merely antiquarian interest. I see him as having a potentially important voice in the contemporary philosophical conversation. That's what we're supposed to do for the mighty dead, is speak for them recollectively. And that's what I've been trying to do, both in the book and this term. So there's not only a lot of Hegel that I've left out from this story, there's even a lot of what we've talked about this term that I've left out, but I couldn't think of a better way to conclude the story than to trace this one strand of thought through Hegel to the contemporary philosophical scene. So I appreciate all of your attention over these many weeks and these difficult and intricate issues. I know that all these things are not easy to take in. That's one of the reasons that I put some effort into building the website as something that will be there after today, permanently, so that you can go back and think about any of the issues that seem to you to be worth thinking about. and revisit some of the claims that in retrospect may have gone by too quickly or that seem to warrant a recollective revisiting. So that should be there for your further attention should you like it. So thank you very much. I hope you find it all to have been worth it.